What if the truth of an action movie was never in the script, but in the scenes somebody ordered to be erased? Imagine a decade when video stores were packed with slow-motion gunfights, exploding arenas, and lone heroes walking away from fire. On the surface, the 1,990 seconds looked like the golden age of mindless action, where story was just an excuse to reload. But if you look closer, in the gaps between what was shot and what you were allowed to see, another history is buried. A mercenary teacher whose sequel was carved into a cheaper, safer product, a military nightmare sold as simple sci-fi spectacle, a terrorist siege in a packed stadium trimmed to stay palatable, a Hong Kong master dragged through the machinery of the MPAA until his film barely looked like his own, a mariachi ballad of revenge that lost its blood-soaked final verse to a ratings board that thought the ending was too much. In cutting rooms and studio offices, these films were argued over, softened, rewritten in the dark. The audience got the official version. The reels kept the confession. These are the 5 films that revealed what Hollywood tried to hide. Film 1, The Substitute 2. School's Out, 1,998. There is a strange silence attached to this sequel, the kind that follows a film reshaped more by what was removed than what was kept. The Substitute 2 arrived only 2 years after the original, but the world behind it had changed. New lead actor, new creative team, and a script that went through so many hands that the final version barely resembled the draft that first excited the producers. Treat Williams stepped into a role built on Tom Berenger's intensity, and with him came a different tone, less psychological tension, more direct-to-video bombast. That shift wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Early production notes hinted at a darker sequel, one that explored corruption inside the education system with a level of grit the studio later felt was too bleak for the market. Major sequences were trimmed or softened, including an entire subplot involving organized crime with tentacles reaching into the school board. Some cast members recalled shooting scenes that never appeared in any cut, suggesting that a substantial portion of the film vanished in late-stage revisions. What survived was a simpler revenge story. Cleaner, cheaper, easier to sell overseas. Behind closed doors, there were disagreements over tone. Some backed a character-driven follow-up, closer to the original. Others pushed for a faster, flashier product to fit the booming 90 seconds home video market. The final film reflects that battle. Familiar fragments of a story that once aimed for weight, stitched into a version designed to move quickly from one action beat to the next. It isn't the film the early drafts promised, but a film shaped by compromise, by budget, and by the quiet calculations of the era's direct-to-video economy. In the end, The Substitute 2 became a lesson in how easily a sequel can lose its identity not through failure, but through the slow erasure of the harder questions it once tried to ask. Film 2, Universal Soldier. Some films are edited for pacing. Others are edited for clarity. Universal Soldier was edited for control. What began as a gritty, near-horror meditation on dehumanization became, through layers of rewrites and studio intervention, a more conventional sci-fi action vehicle, one that disguised just how unsettling the original vision had been. Behind the camera, Roland Emmerich was still rising, still proving he could command large-scale spectacle. Behind the scenes, however, a quieter struggle unfolded. How far could a commercially driven studio allow the film to go before the truth of its tone became too cold, too severe, or too disturbing for a mainstream release? Early footage suggested a story closer to a modern Frankenstein. Soldiers resurrected to serve forever, trapped in a cycle of violence they couldn't understand. Test audiences saw a cut far harsher in mood, where the resurrected men felt like victims rather than unstoppable machines. The studio worried that such a perspective would limit its appeal and pushed for substantial tonal recalibration. Subplots were thinned out. Character beats that emphasized trauma were reduced or removed. Even the dynamic between Van Damme and Lundgren shifted: less tragedy, more clean conflict. What few remember is that the franchise fractured almost immediately after release. 2 television sequels were produced without Emmerich, without Van Damme, and without studio pride. They drifted so far from the original intent that for many years they were treated as if they never existed. Later entries attempted to correct that history, returning to the darker, more psychological core that the initial script hinted at, but by then the timeline had already splintered, and the continuity felt like a palimpsest overwritten too many times. Universal Soldier became a case study in how an action film's identity can shift depending on who holds the scissors. Each version's script, test cut, theatrical release, forgotten sequels tells a different story. And somewhere between them lies the film it might have been, had the early drafts been allowed to breathe without restraint. Film 3 Sudden Death, 1995. Some action films are built on spectacle. Sudden Death was built on tension the studio later tried to soften, reshape, and restrain. On paper, it was one of Jean-Claude Van Damme's most ambitious vehicles of the decade. A high-stakes siege unfolding in real time, set against the noise and energy of the Stanley Cup Finals. But woven underneath the explosions and fistfights was a storyline. The filmmakers initially pushed much harder one grounded in fear, realism, and the vulnerability of everyday civilians caught inside political violence. That ambition would not survive the cutting room intact. Early drafts leaned closer to a thriller than a typical Van Damme showcase. The villains were harsher, the collateral damage heavier, and the moral tone sharper than the studio expected from a mainstream action release. Several scenes, according to cast recollections, depicted the chaos of the arena with a level of intensity that producers felt went too far for a film marketed as entertainment. Entire sequences involving civilian danger were reshot or removed, and the antagonists' motivations were reworked to feel less politically charged. The MPAA's influence was equally significant. The original cut reportedly pushed the edge of the rating threshold, forcing editors to pare back moments of brutality and restructure certain confrontations to avoid what was deemed an unacceptable level of realism. Van Damme himself was said to be frustrated that some of his most grounded, dramatic beats were trimmed in favor of a tighter, more conventional action rhythm. What emerged was still solid, still explosive, still tense but gentler than the version envisioned during production. Yet the most revealing truth lies in how the film was received years later. Viewers sensed that Sudden Death felt oddly restrained for its premise, as though the film hesitated whenever it approached something too raw or too honest. The reason is simple. It did. Between ratings boards, reshoots, and studio caution, the original pulse of the story was dampened. The final product remained entertaining, but the cut that reached theaters was not the story that first crackled on the page. Film 4 Hard Target, 1993. Every action film carries the fingerprints of its director, but Hard Target may be the clearest example of what happens when those fingerprints are deliberately blurred. It was John Woo's first American film the moment Hollywood invited one of Hong Kong's most influential stylists into its system, but the system wasn't ready for him. Hard Target began as a collision between Woo's balletic violence and the American studio machine's discomfort with everything that made his Hong Kong films iconic. The conflict didn't just shape the final cut, it carved it apart. Woo's original vision was longer, more operatic, and far more brutal. Characters lingered in silence, violence unfurled like choreography, and the villains loomed with a mythic intensity the studio later deemed too foreign for US audiences. Test screenings confirmed their fear. Viewers accustomed to straightforward American action found Woo's tone unusual, his rhythm slower, his emphasis on emotional violence too heavy. Universal reacted swiftly. Editors were hired to reshape the film into something more familiar, faster cuts, shorter pauses, fewer symbolic beats, and a significant reduction in the very stylistic flourishes that defined Woo's legacy. The MPAA added another layer of pressure. Woo's signature slow-motion carnage pushed the boundaries of acceptable violence, and to avoid a harsher rating, entire shots were removed or reconfigured. Several scenes involving the hunter's cruelty were softened, and a number of extended shootouts were trimmed until only traces of their original choreography remained. The director's cut that fans whisper about was never released officially, surviving only in rough bootlegs and fading production notes. Even the casting process wasn't free from backstage turbulence. Jean-Claude Van Damme's rising star power gave him influence over certain edits, reportedly shifting the film's balance toward his character and away from Woo's ensemble-driven intent. The resulting film is still stylish, still unmistakably Woo, but it feels like a restrained version of what he tried to create. A compromise between an artist known for operatic mayhem and a studio determined to fit him into a narrower box. The legacy of Hard Target lies not only in its action but in the ghost of the version audiences never saw a reminder of how Hollywood can invite a visionary inside, only to cut away the very things that made him extraordinary. Film 5 Desperado, 1995. Some films arrive already carrying a myth, and Desperado was one of them. It wasn't just a sequel, it was Robert Rodriguez stepping into Hollywood with a reputation forged in the desert, scrappy, dangerous, fiercely independent. El Mariachi had been shot for the price of a used car and became a legend. But legends are difficult to follow, and when Rodriguez brought his raw, sun-bleached style into a studio environment, the collision was inevitable. Desperado may look confident on screen, stylish gunfights, exploding bars, Antonio Banderas drifting through dusty towns like a wounded ghost. But beneath that swagger is the story of a film that the studio tried to polish until it nearly lost its bite. The original cut was bloodier, stranger, and closer in spirit to El Mariachi, small towns trembling under cartel violence, with an atmosphere that bordered on folklore. Rodriguez leaned into operatic action, rhythmic editing, and the surreal comedy that marked his early work. But the studio wanted something else, a film that could sell to audiences expecting a conventional action thriller with international stars. Executives worried that the violence was too extreme, that the pacing was too unconventional, and that Rodriguez's signature experimental energy might confuse mainstream viewers. Scenes vanished. Moments of bleak humor were softened or removed. Several gunfights were trimmed to satisfy ratings boards, who reacted strongly to the stylized brutality of early cuts. The emotional through line involving the mariachi's trauma shot with handheld intensity was reduced to keep the film faster and lighter. Even the iconic opening sequence reportedly had a longer, more chaotic variation that never made it past the first test screening. Yet the most revealing truth is this: Desperado was caught between two identities. Rodriguez wanted to honor the handmade, anarchic spirit of El Mariachi. The studio wanted a sleek American export. What made it to theaters was a hybrid, still powerful, still seductive, but stripped of some of the roughness that gave the original its pulse. The missing footage hasn't resurfaced, but cast and crew memories paint a picture of a darker, more daring cut that lives on only in rumor. Desperado remains a cult classic, but the version audiences know is only part of the story, the version allowed to exist after the fires were cooled, the edges were sanded, and the reel was shaped into something safer for the 90 seconds market. Bonus fact: the cut that vanished before anyone could see it. There is a film from the same era that never found its true form, not because audiences rejected it, but because its most daring version disappeared before the first premiere. The Crow, City of Angels, 1996, was meant to be a harsher, more surreal successor to the original cult classic, a dreamlike descent into grief, corruption, and rebirth. What few viewers realize is that the film that reached theaters was not the one its creators made. It was the version rebuilt after a studio decided the truth at the heart of the story was too bleak, too strange, or too unprofitable to risk. Production insiders recall an early cut that ran nearly 40 minutes longer, painted with an art house sensibility that leaned heavily on symbolism and emotional weight. Director Tim Pope envisioned a film drenched in melancholy and mysticism, where violence felt more like ritual than spectacle. Test audiences, however, reacted with confusion, and the studio reacted with panic. What followed was one of the most aggressive recuts of the decade. Scenes reshuffled, character arcs simplified, subplots eliminated entirely. Even the tone shifted from a meditation on loss to a more conventional revenge narrative. Actors later spoke openly about the missing material, including emotional beats that gave depth to the central characters, and a final act that followed a more operatic trajectory. The director publicly disowned the theatrical cut, emphasizing that the film he intended to release was never allowed to exist. Rumors persist that the original cut was stored away, inaccessible, and possibly lost. Whether it survives physically is unclear. What is certain is that it survives in the memories of those who made it. This is the other kind of cinematic disappearance, not the erasure of a film because it failed, but the erasure of a version because it dared to be something else. The audience didn't reject it. They simply never got the chance to decide. Some films fail on screen, others were never even allowed to fail. History remembers action films for their noise, the gunfire, the stunts, the impact. But return to the editing rooms where these 5 films were shaped, and a different truth emerges. The loudest moments were never the ones that mattered. What mattered were the choices made in silence. The pages rewritten at midnight, the reels trimmed by cautious hands, the ideas softened until they no longer threatened the expectations of their era. Each film carries a ghost version of itself, a path not taken, a heartbeat muted beneath the official cut. The substitute too once reached for grit before being sanded into something safer. Universal Soldier hid a darker identity beneath its sci-fi armor. Sudden Death tightened itself until the raw edges disappeared. Hard Target fought valiantly to preserve John Woo's voice, only to be carved into a version deemed more acceptable. Desperado walked a tightrope between independent fire and studio polish, losing pieces of its soul along the way. And the bonus film, a reminder that some visions vanish entirely, casts a shadow across them all. This is the paradox of Hollywood. Stories built on conflict often hide their greatest battles behind the camera. What the audience sees is shaped not only by artistry, but by fear, by calculation, by the invisible negotiation between vision and market. In that negotiation, truths are bent, softened, or buried outright. Yet fragments survive rumors, lost cuts, whispered memories of scenes that once existed. They remind us that cinema has two realities, the one projected onto the screen, and the one that flickers quietly in the dark, just out of reach. So we return to these films not to expose scandal, but to understand the shadows behind the spectacle. Because sometimes the most honest part of a story is the version you were never meant to see. What other hidden film histories do you want to uncover next? Real secrets, where the truth was always in the edit.